On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, falling container rates. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this episode. So, one of the biggest issues going on right now in ocean shipping is the cataclysmic off-a-cliff dive that ocean freight rates are currently taking. Now, I should say this is not really a surprise. Everybody knew ocean freight rates were going to come down. We were at the top of Mount Everest here. But it was only a matter of time till they came down. What is a little bit surprising for everybody here is the rate at which it's falling off a cliff and that it's falling right now. Everybody expected maybe a little bit later. Some predicted a little earlier. So the timing is a little bit. So what I want to do in this video is really break down why ocean container rates are falling right now and what are the impacts. And one of my favorites is Drewry posted a series of 4 questions, which I think are really important to ask going forward into 2023. So we're going to tackle all those issues today on this video. If you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's jump into this. So Costas Paris had this great story in the Wall Street Journal. Cargo ship owners cancel sailings as global trade flips from backlogs to empty containers. And this is just one of the mainstream media stories that are out there. I could have hit a whole dozen of these, but they're all catching on to the issue that we're seeing these changes right now in the ocean freight rates. And a lot of issues behind the effort here. And we're going to, like I said, break it down here a little bit. But one of the things that Costas hits on that I think is really important here, and I'm going to come down to this chart right here he has, there we go, is that there are a lot more ships coming. And ship construction, particularly in container ships, has been through the roof. I've talked about this in past videos. What we're seeing right now in ship construction is really twofold things. One, new types of vessels with propulsion plants. So more efficient, more green vessels, that can use alternative fuels, LNG, green methanol, different types of fuel that basically burn cleaner. And this is all part of the effort to get to IMO 2050, where you get a 50% carbon reduction from what ships were burning back in 2008. The second issue here is right-sizing the type of ships that are out there. The 3 big groups you're seeing built right now are small feeder vessels, basically a few thousand TEU, therefore basically shuttling between ports, largely in Asia and Europe. The second group you're seeing built are these kind of handy size container ships, which would have been huge vessels not too long ago, but vessels roughly between 4,000 to 7,000 TEU. And then these neo-Panamax vessels, the vessels of up to 15,000 TEU that can go through the new lane of the Panama Canal. And one of the things I think that's not being looked at here, and I'm going to throw it out here right now, is the amount of vessel scrapping that's going to be done here over the next few years. Almost no scrapping from 2020 to the present, but that is going to change dramatically. And what we're going to see here is vessels going away very quickly and fleets getting smaller as these new vessels come in to replace them. More efficient, more correctly sized for the trade. Coming into the sites that we tend to look at here. So here's Mike Schuller's story over in G Captain talking about this container shipping turning point. Long-term rates start to slide. Now, what we had seen happening here was the drop of spot rates. So difference between long-term spot rates. Spot rates are the rates you get right then. I need to ship something immediately. Let me see what's available. Now, a spot rate can be low, medium, high. It just depends on the marketplace. The really high rates you saw over the past 2 years, that $25,000 for a box across the Pacific, that was a spot rate. That was, man, I need to take advantage of the marketplace right now. I need goods immediately. I need to jump the front of the line. I'm going to pay a premium to get my good across. Long-term rates are the rates that companies get into with ocean carriers for the long term. You know, it's pre-planned. There's capacity planned on this, and you negotiate out these rates. But what we're starting to see right now is while the spot rates had taken the big dive, because again, there wasn't that much spot activity out there, the long-term rates are beginning to fall. And a couple of quotes here from Xeneta, and Xeneta is one of the 2 companies to watch when it comes to container, in my opinion, Xeneta, and another one we're going to talk about is Drewry's here in a second. But a quote here by the CEO, Patrick Berglund. It had happened sooner or later. We've seen a steady and at times spectacular uptick of long-term contracted rates since the early days of the pandemic. This has fueled record-breaking carrier profits, much to the dismay of the financially stressed shipper community. But over the past couple of months, clear signs of a market shift have emerged. And when you come down this story, you start getting into some of the details. Xeneta's shipping index benchmark is still 112% higher than it was in September 2021, and carriers have certainly proved themselves savvy at upholding profits even as demand weakens. Remember, August numbers we're waiting for the September numbers now, but August numbers were through the roof, except for LA that came down in the United States. We saw Long Beach. We saw all these ports around the United States that had record numbers: Savannah, Houston, New York, New Jersey. New York, New Jersey surpassed LA. So we definitely saw this across the board. We're still getting these massive volumes in, but what we're about to see is that drop off. This story from Splash 24/7, our buddy Sam Chambers over there. Box contract rates fall. And again, he talks about it. The shoe is finally on the other foot. He also talked to Patrick Berglund about this and very similar ideas here. And he goes down here a little bit, gets into some details here. We're in the highly unusual situation that the Atlantic spot rate is now more than double of the rate of the Pacific into the U.S. West Coast, almost 30% higher than the Asia Northern Europe rate level, commented Lars Jensen from Vespucci Maritime. So remember a couple of things really important to note now. In the height of the supply chain crisis, you had the massive backlog off the port of LA and Long Beach. And that clog off the port of LA and Long Beach had a massive impact. Shippers, those who ship the cargo, not the ones who run the ships. The ones who run the ships are called carriers. The ones who ship the cargo are called shippers. It's confusing. It's ocean shipping. The shippers realized, listen, why are we jamming everything into LA and Long Beach? All we're getting from them is threats of hyper-demurrage, $100 per day per box that's left there. And plus, they had a labor situation where the ILWU was in contract renegotiations with the Pacific Maritime Association, which they haven't resolved yet. They've been working without a contract since June 30th. And so what happened is a lot of shippers started moving their cargo. Plus, you had the rail issue. And remember, only 20% of the U.S. population is west of Texas. And so a lot of cargo that was going into LA and Long Beach was going in there because there was volume, there was capacity to go in there. LA and Long Beach let you keep your containers in the terminals there for a long time. Came back to bite them in the ass. But they let you keep their containers there for a long time. And when LA and Long Beach just imploded in some ways, shippers began going the alternate route. They started putting their cargo on these big, ultra-large container vessels heading westward across the Indian Ocean into Europe and then across the Atlantic, or via those Neo-Panamax vessels bypassing LA and Long Beach, going through the Panama Canal and up to the east and Gulf Coast. And so all of that meant that a lot of volume was going out of LA and Long Beach, but now shifting over to the East Coast, Gulf Coast. Now, those rates are still high, and we're going to talk about the difference about that right now. So let's go ahead and jump over here. So this is the Freightos Baltic Index for global container, and you'll see it's down to 4,060. Now, this is a composite index of all rates everywhere, and you'll see the track record of this rate. We're basically dipping down below where we were in January of 21 when we had that huge, massive uptick. But if you go down prior to March of 20, you'll see that this global index was bouncing right around 13 to 1,400. Roughly, that's basically where it's at. But if you come over here and look at some of these specific rates, so for example, the Chinese East Asia to North America route is now below 3,000, 2,951. But notice how high it is. It is still substantially higher than where it was. Come down here, China East Asia to North American East Coast, 6,940, also substantially higher. But remember, 49% of cargo based on the National Retail Federation in their September report, and this was as of July, said 49% of containers are going into the West Coast, 51% is going into the Gulf and East Coast. So 49% into the West Coast, 51% into the Gulf and East Coast. And so it's this rate that's really having the big impact. Now, they're all falling, which is exactly what you want. And it's not just on the Freightos index. If we go over here to Xeneta, for example, here's the rate from the Far East to the U.S. West Coast. Their rate's still a little higher than 3,000. They're not quite at what Freightos is at. They're bouncing here just above 3,000, 3,395. And so we're seeing that rate still high. But again, look at where it's falling from. Look at that number. And again, these are for the long-term rates, not for the spot rates. But now we're seeing the falling of both those rates. Look here, this is the one index that I found really interesting. This is from Sea Intelligence. This is comparing different routes. The Shanghai LA route, which is in blue, and you can see that route just dropping tremendously right here. The Shanghai to New York, still high, but it is coming down, but not as much as some of the other ones we're seeing. The Rotterdam to New York is actually sitting there pretty steady right now, and that's interesting. That indicates to me two issues. One, the amount of freight that's coming via Europe to the United States has increased, but it also has to do with the port issues in Germany, Great Britain, because of labor strikes. It's keeping that rate up pretty high. And then finally, the yellow, the Shanghai to Rotterdam route. Again, a significant amount of cargo coming through here. This is from FreightWaves, their sonar, the Ocean TEU volume index. This is measuring, again, the number of containers that are basically booked to come into the United States. And there's a couple of interesting things on this chart. Again, I always love looking at some of this data and trying to figure it. So here you can see the big, huge dip that happened at really the end of mid 2020, right when COVID was hitting. Had a bit of a peak right there, but then all of a sudden it dropped off. But then all of a sudden it began to build, and you see the peaks here. And now we're basically coming down off that level a bit. All of this indicates that the number of boxes coming across to the United States are leveling out. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Let's be clear. One of the things is a lot of shippers front-loaded their cargo to the first half of 2022 because of the potential issue on the West Coast. A lot of shippers were getting their cargo as quick and across as fast as they could. They wanted to get them in. The other problem you had is we've been shipping cargo across for really 3 different economies. We had the pre-COVID economy, we had the COVID economy, and now we have a post-COVID economy. What do I mean by that? Pre-COVID, we knew what everyone wanted. Amazon and all the retailers knew what to expect, what to order, what to buy based on the algorithms they had figured out. COVID upset that. People were buying different things. Why is it all of a sudden you run out of residential toilet paper? Because people aren't peeing and pooing at work. That's basically it. And so you weren't using commercial toilet paper. They underestimated the amount that was needed, and it took a while to catch up with the system, hence the great toilet paper shortage of 2020. Now we're seeing the same thing because we're coming post-COVID. We don't know how many people are going back to work, how many people are staying at home. We're in this new economy, and nobody quite knows what exactly to ship and not to ship. We're still figuring and building the algorithms for that. We're also in a different position because the ocean shippers are in a much different position. This is not 2008 when the ocean shippers were really not well organized in alliances and agreements. Top 9 ocean carriers are in 3 alliances, along with really the 10th one, Zim, which is basically almost in an alliance now. But if you look at the top 10 carriers, they control 85% of the containers. And even though you had these little container companies jump in on the LA route for a while there, they're gone now. They've been pushed out by the big carriers. And so what we're seeing is the ocean carriers are trying to manipulate the system to try to artificially keep rates high because of the profits they made. And how do they do that? They start blank sailing. They start canceling routes. This story from Lodestar, Maersk suspends Asia-U.S. East Coast loop. This one directly from Lodestar. MSC leads the charge as transpacific container rate service cull begins. Maersk and MSC are in the 2M alliance. They control 35% of the routes across the waters of the ocean, so that when they start canceling routes, start closing loops, that's significant. What do I mean by that? So, for example, This is blank sailings. What this means is you cancel a sailing of a ship. You just don't sail it. And, you would have regular service. It's like booking an airline flight and all of a sudden you cancel it. We're seeing that right now with airlines with the shortage of pilots. And so they're canceling it. In this case, they're doing it because of shortage of cargo. If they don't think there's enough cargo to sail a ship, they're blank sailing. And you'll see back in 2019, all of a sudden this number, or at the end of 2019, 2020, this peaked over 50%. Why? Because people stopped ordering everything. So when COVID hit, they stopped. And what you've seen here is the number of blank sailings. This is between Asia and North America West Coast. And you see them ticking up, ticking up, ticking up. And what that tells you is that they're trying to get capacity off the routes. They're slow steaming ships. They're loading ships to the gunnels with cargo as full as they can get them, which is what was happening during COVID. But now they're removing vessels from sailing, and that's slowing up. That leads to gaps in LA and Long Beach, for example. And they're canceling certain routes. So like this, the TP3 route that Maersk operates from Ningbo, Shanghai to Los Angeles, they're cutting it out. They're not doing these direct express routes. They're going to cut this out and instead cargo. There's still routes coming from Ningbo and Shanghai to LA. It's just a different route with ships making more stops. They're also stopping this route, the TP28 route, which comes from Vietnam to China through the Panama Canal to Houston and Norfolk. Again, they're getting rid of this route. There's still plenty of routes out here. And if you go to the ocean carriers, you can find all these routes and how ships move. It's really interesting to see. So you can see how they're moving. And what this means is they're trying to maximize their profits by minimizing their sailings, which is a key thing, right? If you can't control the demand for cargo, let's control the supply of ships coming across. But there's a point where that becomes negative to them because they're not shipping enough cargo, they're not generating enough revenue, and this is where the potential is. Usually you would also have competition. You would have the ocean carriers competing against each other. We saw that in 2008 when this happened. But again, we're in a situation different than 2008 where the top 10 carriers are in these alliances and the situation is much different. Look at what's going on in the U.S. This is the latest heat map done by MSNBC. And you'll see right here that New York, New Jersey, and Houston are marked as congestion, largely because of the number of vessels off their port. Savannah may kick back to this because Savannah had to temporarily sortie vessels away from the port because of Hurricane Ian. But even there in the yellow, the one place you see in green here is Seattle, Tacoma. All other ports are still showing, and Virginia, Virginia's been very efficient this whole time. I really have to laud Virginia. I need to talk about this more because Virginia has been one of these ports behind the scenes. It's been doing a great deal of work here. So while rates are going down, one of the things we're seeing is reliability is starting to kick back up. As ocean carriers have to deal with less congestion, that means they are providing more service, better service. This is the irony of ocean shipping. The least reliable service is when you're paying the most. The most reliable service is when you're paying the least. And you can see that right here. You can see purple 2022 kicking back up, heading back to where 2020 was that massive dive. And at the same time, you're seeing less weight in ports. We're down to under 6-day wait in ports for vessel arrivals. That's key. If you're shipping cargo, you can get to more of this just-in-time logistics. We haven't done that. If there's one group that's been benefiting right now that's doing extremely well in this economy, it's warehouses. Warehouses have been chock-a-blocked with goods this whole time. And then finally, this one was a really interesting graphic that I pulled up, which deals with China congestion. And one of the interesting things here, you see China container vessel congestion, number of vessels waiting at anchorages, number of vessels, seasonality here, and you can see it by years. And 2021 is in orange right here, or a reddish color, and you can see where 2022 is in green, where it's below what was happening in 2021. And most importantly here, container vessels completed waiting time is getting back into the norm. So we seem to be shifting back into a period of normality here where we're returning back to regular scheduled routes and services. The question is going to be is where the rates level out at. I'm a firm believer we don't get to pre-COVID rates. I still think we're going to be double pre-COVID rates because of the organizations of the container liners. So let's look at a series of questions that Drewry post, which I found really interesting to look at. So in question number one, Drewry is posing this question. Should we move away from fixed rates and switch to the spot market? And with rates now 40% lower on contract rates, that seems like a smart move to do. But what Drewry is saying in this is it's not really about cost so much, but it's really about service. And you don't want to ruin your relationships with ocean shippers. And so it may be better to stay where you're at. For smaller shippers, and smaller shippers are the ones that really got screwed during the peak rate because they were paying through the nose for this. The spot market makes more sense. You can better adjust and sit there in a spot market and take your cargo and wait for the proper rate to come through. All right, question number two. Should we expect lower contract rates in 2023 and go to bid later? Well, what Drewry is talking about is yes and yes, that we should expect lower rates and that you should bid later. I think it's very clear first half of 2023 is going to be a much different year than we've seen over the past 3 years, 2020, 2021, 2022. Definitely going to see it. Contract rates are going to be much lower. It's a good idea to wait to then to begin bidding. Drewry, obviously recommends you follow them for this. But it's an uncertain market. Now, the only thing I would add to this is there's a lot of issues that are still hitting right now that can cause uncertainty in the market. Labor is, I think, the big variable right now. What happens with labor strikes, and should there be port closures again because of COVID lockdowns, particularly in China, which is having an impact. So I think you got to be a little bit careful in that one. Question three, how do we bring back more favorable terms to our shipper carrier contracts? I just don't know if that's going to be even possible at this time, because again, the ocean carriers are doing a lot to monopolize routes. They're not getting to the position where their one alliance takes more than 40% of the route, but they're in a pretty good agreements here to do this. Both the European Union and the United States is looking at these blocks to see what they can do. And one of the things that Drewry says, but with the market moving to overcapacity, the pendulum will swing again, and shippers can review their contracts and request more free time, longer payment terms, and higher service level commitments from carriers. So you'll get a better deal from the ocean carrier. It's more profitable for you. I think it's a very good move that Drewry is saying right here. And then finally, question four, should we drop providers who treated our company badly during the undercapacity crisis? Man, wouldn't you like to do it? Just fire everybody? But again, you have a limited number of carriers out there, particularly on certain routes. And even though you've dealt with these problems, is it good to burn your bridge? Drewry says it would be tempting, but not advisable to seek revenge against the drop previous ocean carriers and NVOCs. I will say, however, that probably what you're going to see is regulatory bodies like the Federal Maritime Commission and the European Union being much more proactive for the shipper vice the ocean carrier. And I think that is a big appeal for them. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope we got a chance to explain what is happening with ocean containers and freight rates. As I said before, it's a really complicated process. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of variables. Just because what's happening today, gives you an insight doesn't mean the same will be happening tomorrow. Again, we've been dive bombed by black swan events here over the past 2 years, and I expect them to continue to happen going into 2023. It's very hard to get the pond settled once you throw the huge boulder in it and you keep throwing rocks in right behind it. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the world of ocean freight. If you enjoyed today's video, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. You can do that one of two ways, especially those of you making a lot of money off my insight. Come on, contribute a little bit to Sal. You can do that by hitting that super thanks button below. That allows you to contribute directly to the page, or you can head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. You can support it monthly or yearly. That allows me to put these videos together and to provide insight to you. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.